Okay, so we are at the last part of Lecture 4 over the Revolution. So we talked about last time, we talked about how Native people were experiencing U.S. independence as a real threat to their own freedom. But African Americans see it as an opportunity to claim their freedom. When the U.S. declared its independence from Britain in 1776, the slave population was right around 500,000 people. So about 20% of the U.S. population was enslaved. Slave owning and slave trading were just accepted parts of colonial life. Advertisements that announced the sale of slaves or looking for runaway slaves filled colonial newspapers. And sometimes the same issue of a patriotic newspaper would have like a rallying cry for freedom on one page, and then the next page would have slave sale notices. Well, slavery played a central part in the language, in the rhetoric of the Revolution. Apart from liberty, slavery was the word used most frequently in the political literature. Liberty, what they want; slavery, what they feel like they have. 18th century writers frequently contrasted liberty and slavery, but they're using the word slavery in a very political way. They're using it as shorthand for being denied certain political rights. So people who couldn't vote were enslaved. Because the colonists don't have representatives in Parliament, they're enslaved. Having to pay their taxes was slavery. It got so ridiculous that in 1774, one writer in South Carolina declared that his colony was a sacred land of freedom, and that they must never allow slavery to erect her throne in South Carolina. Now, remember, South Carolina had the highest percentage of actual slaves in North America. More than half that colony's population was actually enslaved. Now, some colonial writers would make the connection between slavery as a metaphor and slavery as a reality. Some of them argued that actual slavery was proof that Britain was corrupt. And surely if the colonies become independent, slavery will be abolished. That was pretty rare, though. Most colonial writers really didn't like to tackle the issue of slavery as a concrete reality. But the presence of hundreds of thousands of slaves powerfully affected the meaning of freedom for revolutionary leaders. One Brit pointed out that the fact that colonists were familiar with slavery made them more sensitive to threats on their own liberty. He said that when freedom was a privilege and not a common right, those who were free knew what they had to lose. On the other hand, an awful lot of Brits thought it was kind of funny and kind of hypocritical that the loudest calls for freedom seemed to be coming from big slave owners. Now, today, the contradiction between slavery and freedom is really obvious to us, so it's hard to understand how powerful the obstacles to abolition were back then. At the time of the Revolution, slavery was already an old institution in America. Slavery existed in every colony, and it was the basis of the economy and the society of every colony from Delaware down to Georgia. At least 40% of Virginia and more than half of South Carolina and Georgia were enslaved. Thomas Jefferson owned 100 slaves when he was busy writing about mankind's unalienable rights. And everything that Jefferson enjoyed in his life ultimately rested on slave labor. And so, in a sense, everything that we enjoy today because of Thomas Jefferson ultimately rests on slave labor. We owe to him, and we owe to his slaves. Think about it like this. Jefferson's a genius, right? Like, nobody's going to deny that Thomas Jefferson was a genius. But what if he'd grown up in a poor family out in the frontier? What if he'd had to get up at dawn to go milk the cows? And what if he'd been plowing the fields? And what if he had been working from sunup to sundown? What time would he have had to learn Latin and learn French and learn all of this philosophy and become a philosopher himself and study science. There were lots of smart guys out on the frontier who just didn't have the opportunities that he had. He has better opportunities because his family's wealthy, and his family's wealth rests on slavery. His family could afford to get him a private tutor when he was a young child. He didn't have to get up in the morning. He didn't have to do any of that back-breaking labor. All he had to do was focus on his studies. Then they were able to send him away to college. They were able to send him to William and Mary, and he didn't have to worry about who's going to do the chores back home and who's going to take care of the family and how they're going to afford it. He knows how all that's going to be taken care of. Then he gets sent to the Second Continental Congress, where he writes the Declaration of Independence, and he doesn't have to worry about who's going to take care of his wife and children because they've got slaves to take care of them. He goes to Paris as a diplomat. He buys the books that will become the foundation of our Library of Congress on wealth that he got because his slaves were running his farm for him. When he became president, he didn't have to worry who's going to handle his plantation. He's got slaves that he trusts to do that. So all of these things that Jefferson did, not to minimize what he did, but just to say there are all of these people whose names we don't know, whose records have been lost and we'll never know their names, who helped build the foundation, unwillingly build the foundation that everything Jefferson did rests on. The Revolution inspired widespread hope among slaves, but they had a lot of hurdles that they had to jump over. There were just a lot of roadblocks in the way. The Revolution raised some questions about the status of slavery in the U.S. The revolutionaries said that liberty was an absolute good, and that freedom was a universal entitlement, not a privilege only for a few. Now, some folks on the more radical end of the revolution, like Tom Paine and Ben Rush and guys like that, and of course Quakers, started to suggest that independence ought to be for every person across the board. Now, the Enlightenment and people who were learned in philosophy said that slavery was morally wrong, economically inefficient, and a relic of a barbaric past. Jefferson said that. He said that while he owned slaves. Now, some folks, mostly Quakers, had been abolitionists before, but it's the Revolution that makes slavery part of the national debate. Ben Rush called for a general liberty of the people and warned that slavery will one day bring about a national punishment. Jefferson, in private, condemned slavery as a system that caused much more misery than anything the colonists had to complain about. And most dramatically, slaves themselves understood that the Revolution was a prime time to demand their rights. The language of liberty, all of this rhetoric of natural rights and consent of the governed, and that spread through slave communities in the North and the South. And they heard patriot leaders, sometimes their owners, talking about the unalienable rights of man. They lived, most of them, near the free, but they never enjoyed the benefits of freedom. So slaves used patriotic phrases and ideology for their own needs. And the most insistent advocates of freedom as a universal right were African Americans, who demanded that revolutionary leaders live up to what they say they believe. Now, the first concrete steps toward emancipation in revolutionary America were a set of freedom petitions sent by groups of slaves in New England to their colonial governments in the early 1770s. And they asked how the colonies could demand to be free from English tyranny, but not seek that same freedom for their black residents. Some northern slaves sued in court for being illegally detained in servitude, and a couple of people actually did get their freedom that way. But really, it's the turmoil and the chaos of war that offered better paths to freedom. Many slaves ran away and tried to pass as freeborn. There's a dramatic increase in the number of runaway advertisements during the Revolution. Right at the start of this era, really, in 1776, a black man who served in the Massachusetts militia urged white Americans to extend their concept of freedom. He said that if liberty were really an innate principle for all mankind, then all mankind, including those of African descent, have the same rights to it. Petitions and pamphlets and sermons by African American ministers demanded that white patriots understand that when they are asking for liberty, they are required to pass it on. And they got really angry when patriot leaders would use slavery as a metaphor without ever engaging in the reality of slavery. They wanted these patriot leaders to understand that slavery is a concrete, lived experience for 500,000 people. It doesn't mean not having a vote. It doesn't mean having to pay your taxes. It means being forced to work without pay against your will. It means being whipped. It means dying young. It means having your children taken away from you and sold. It means seeing your mothers and your sisters and your daughters abused. Now, most slaves in this generation had either been born as free people in Africa, or they were only like a generation removed from that. So they don't need white leaders to tell them what freedom is. They don't need the Declaration of Independence to tell them that freedom is their birthright. They know that. Phyllis Wheatley was a slave. She was also the first black woman to be published in the United States. She was a very famous poet in the 18th century. And she wrote that her love of freedom came from being born free and then snatched, as she said, from Africa's shores. She was really cool, actually. She published her first poem when she was 12 years old, and her owners were really proud of having this educated, internationally admired woman as their slave. One of her books had to be published with a signed testimonial from prominent white citizens in Boston swearing up and down that she was actually the person who wrote this book. I mean, it was difficult to convince a lot of white people that African Americans had intellect. But when black people used the specific words of the Revolution to demand their freedom, it showed how Americanized, how African American they were becoming, their communities were becoming. Now, at the beginning of the war, George Washington would not accept black troops in the Continental Army. But he changed his mind after some British commanders offered freedom to any slave who would enlist in the British Army. So when Washington opened up the Continental Army, he got about 5,000 black men. And since wealthy men were allowed to send substitutes in their place to the militias, suddenly slaves had something that they could bargain with. And a significant number gained their freedom by agreeing to serve in the place of their owner. In 78, Rhode Island formed an entirely black regiment and promised freedom to any slave who would enlist. Black men who fought under Washington or who fought in the state militias fought in integrated units. They were the last black Americans to be officially integrated until the Korean War in the 1950s. Now, most of the southern colonies, except for South Carolina and Georgia, the southern colonies also allowed free black men and slaves to fight. And they were often not explicitly promised freedom, but many received it after the war. And in 1783, once the war had ended, the Virginia state legislature just issued a blanket emancipation for any slave who had served in the army. But for a lot of people, it looked like siding with the British would offer them more opportunities for freedom. At least 800 Virginia slaves fought in just one regiment in the British Army. Washington lost 17 of his own slaves to the British, nearly 100,000 slaves, so that is 20% of the total slave population, deserted their owners and fled to the British lines. Many of them got jobs with the Royal Army as cooks, as laundresses, as laborers. About 20,000 joined the British when they left America, going to Canada or Europe. For a brief moment, it looked like all of the upheaval of the Revolution might actually at least really challenge slavery, if not end it entirely. During the Revolution, every state outlawed the slave trade. Every state outlawed importing more people from Africa. So they thought, gosh, maybe after the Revolution, maybe we can keep that slave trade ban. That'll slow things down. Unfortunately, that won't work. The states will go back to importing new slaves. The war left a lot of the plantation system in ruins. And so people said, well, okay, so they're going to have to rebuild. The plantations will have to rebuild. Maybe they'll rebuild in a way that doesn't allow them to use slavery anymore. That didn't work either. During the 1780s, a considerable number of slave owners in Virginia and Maryland did voluntarily free their slaves. But in the vast majority of the South, that didn't happen. When Charleston, South Carolina, was under attack by the British, the leaders of South Carolina debated whether they should free slaves in exchange for those slaves helping defend the city. And they decided not to do it. They would rather lose Charleston than free the slaves. And they did lose Charleston. Now, every state in the North did start taking some steps toward emancipation. In 77, the new state of Vermont drew up a constitution that explicitly banned slavery. The others usually did gradual emancipation programs, very slow-moving emancipation. Even in the North, where there wasn't widespread slavery, it was kind of hard to get emancipation off the ground. Property rights were usually a roadblock there. Even people who opposed slavery kind of shied away from taking what was legally defined as someone else's property, even if that property was a person. Usually, aside from Vermont, usually these new abolition laws in the North did not free current slaves. Typically, they said that any child born in the future would be set free after they had served a certain number of years. So New Jersey passed their emancipation law in 1804, and New Jersey said that any child born to a slave mother after 1804 will serve 21 years as a slave, and then they will be set free. Pennsylvania said that children had to serve for 28 years. So essentially, these children become like the last generation of indentured servants. Their parents are slaves, but they will be set free after a certain number of years. And so abolition in the North was a really slow, drawn-out process. For slaves who were already born when the abolition laws were passed, the law's not going to help them. Their hope for freedom still rested on the ability to escape, or their owners maybe voluntarily freeing them. And, many northern slave owners were very reluctant to free their slaves. In New York City, there were only 76 voluntary manumissions, owners voluntarily freeing their slaves, between the end of the Revolution and the turn of the century. The first national census in 1790 recorded 21,000 slaves, still in New York, 11,000 in New Jersey. As late as 1830, the census showed about 3,500 slaves still living in northern states. In 1860, that's 1 year before the Civil War starts, there were 18 very elderly slaves still living in New Jersey, people who had been born before that law passed. All in all, the Revolution had a contradictory impact on American slavery, and therefore it had a contradictory impact on American freedom. As gradual as emancipation was, as slow going as it was, and as long as it took, the start of abolition in the North did still draw a line across the nation. It helped to create what would become a dangerous division between those states that were defined as free states, even though they still sometimes had a handful of slaves, and those that were still explicitly slave states. Abolition in the North, the voluntary manumission in the Upper South, and then the escape of thousands of slaves also created a large free black population. And many of these people took on new names like Freeman or Freeland. Now, on the eve of independence, almost every black person in America had been a slave. By the turn of the century, though, there will be entire free communities with their own churches and schools and leaders. And those communities created a real challenge to the logic of slavery. The justification for slavery is increasingly racist. It's increasingly based on this idea that people of African descent don't know how to be free. But wherever there's a free community, it proves that that's a lie. And these communities were also a place for runaways to hide. And they were a springboard for the new, more active abolitionist movement. Now, in 76, there were fewer than 10,000 free people of African descent. By 1810, there were nearly 200,000 free black people. In all of the states except for Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, free black men who paid taxes or met the property qualifications were allowed to vote. They were citizens until about the start of the 1800s. Then we will see states go back and change their laws to revoke the citizenship rights, even for free black people. For many Americans, white and black, the existence of slavery was a disgrace to American ideals and American freedom and what they wanted to build in this new nation. But even so, slavery survived the Revolution, and it will grow. That first national census in 1790 showed that, yes, there were many more free African Americans than there had been before the Revolution, but there were also more slaves. In 1790, we had 200,000 more slaves than we'd had in 1776. The revolutionary generation included a bunch of women as well, who contributed to the fight for independence. Some of them literally. Deborah Sampson disguised herself as a man and served under Washington in the Continental Army from about 1781 to 83. She fought in several skirmishes. She was wounded twice. The first time she extracted the bullet from her own leg because she didn't want the doctor to discover her secret. The second time she passed out, and then the doctor did discover her secret. She was eventually awarded a soldier's pension by Congress. Mary Hayes Macaulay, she followed her husband as he was a soldier in the Continental Army, and so she was a camp follower. She would follow him around and, tend to his wounds and cook his food and wash his uniform. A lot of wives did that. A lot of not wives did that too. And at the Battle of Monmouth, he was wounded. He was a cannoneer. He worked in the artillery regiments. And so she took his place when her husband was wounded. She took his place loading ammunition into the cannon. The Patriot women also took part in protests and in mob actions against corrupt officials and corrupt merchants. They spun and wove cloth. They sewed uniforms. They did the laundry and cooked for the troops. They passed along information about British troop movements. Martha Washington joined her husband during the winter encampments, and she was instrumental in keeping up soldiers' morale during that awful winter at Valley Forge. In Philadelphia, Ben Franklin's daughter, Sarah Franklin Bache, organized a ladies' association to raise money to help buy supplies for the troops. She issued broadsides calling on the women of America to join the cause. And this was a really well-organized group, actually. They set up in every county a ladies' association with a treasurer who would collect all the money from the women in the county, and then she would send it on to either the governor's wife, if she was a patriot, but if the governor's wife was a damn dirty Tory, then the county treasurers would send the money to Mistress Washington. Now, the ladies' associations called themselves Brave Americans Who Are Born to Liberty, and they showed how the Revolution was pushing women into new kinds of public activism that traditionally women didn't have. At home, women are debating politics and independence. John Adams' wife, Abigail, was a really shrewd political analyst. She was also one of the most articulate and influential women of this era. Education for girls was still pretty limited, but she taught herself by reading her father's books. And during the Revolution, John was away in Philadelphia with the Continental Congress, and then he went to Europe as a diplomat. And so she was in charge of running the family farm and keeping John informed of events. And she gave him her unvarnished opinion on everything that was happening. And then when John Adams became president, they said that he relied really more on Abigail's advice than on his cabinet. In March of '76, just a few months before the Second Continental Congress declared independence, Abigail wrote her best-known letter to John. She began by calling out the evils of slavery, wondering how a slave owner could really support liberty. Then she urged John to, as she said, remember the ladies. She said that women might not obey laws if they have no voice in creating those laws. Abigail has read John Locke, right? Just like Thomas Jefferson has, just like most of the elite dudes have. She's read John Locke. She knows classical liberalism. She knows natural rights and government by consent of the governed, and the right to rebel against unjust government. And she's warning John that that might happen. Now, other women advised and debated, and the first history of the Revolution was written by a woman, Mercy Otis Warren. But gender still formed a boundary that kept women from the full blessings of American freedom. Women might ask for consideration and equal rights from their husbands, but they can't demand it in the law. Coverture still existed. The husband still had legal authority over the person and property and choices of his wife. For men, freedom meant the right to self-government, the power to make and consent to laws. It's the social contract. Women weren't seen as part of the social contract. For women, the marriage contract is more powerful. A woman's relationship to the larger society was supposed to be via her husband. In law, women were not seen as having the essential quality that was needed to be a citizen, to participate. They don't have autonomy. I mean, Abigail's husband John believed that even men who owned no land were unfit for politics. So how could he possibly believe that his wife was fit for it? Women couldn't own property. Married women couldn't own property. They were entirely dependent on their husbands, and husbands could legally punish their wives for stepping outside of their boundaries. Now, that doesn't mean that always happened. I certainly don't think that John Adams was ever brave enough to do something like that to Abigail. She was a lot taller than him, for one thing. Men took pride in having qualities like independence and assertiveness and aggression that they said distinguished them, made them different from women. And men also tended to believe that the right to control their wives was a part of their freedom. On a petition from a group of slaves demanding freedom, one of the grievances that they listed was that their wives were not allowed to submit to their husbands. Wives had to submit to their owners instead, when she ought to obey her husband. They said that slavery took away the right of a man to have his wife's obedience. Now, a lot of men considered women to be naturally submissive and emotional and irrational, and therefore not fit for citizenship. While public debate viewed men's rights as natural entitlements, discussions of women's rights, when they occurred, really emphasized duty, not liberty. If women had rights, they weren't political rights. They came from their roles as wives and mothers. Of the new state constitutions, only New Jersey granted the right to vote to women who met the property requirements. But then in 1807, New Jersey went back and changed that. They added the words male and white to their voting laws, disenfranchised all their women and all their free black men. The citizen of a republic was really assumed to be male. In one court case that kind of illustrates the way that women were seen, the state of Massachusetts had seized land that belonged to a widow that under the law traditionally would have gone to her son. And they seized it because she had remarried, and during the Revolution her husband was a loyalist. So her husband fled to England during the Revolution and took her son to England with him. And so Massachusetts confiscated the land. But when the woman's son, by her first husband, when he came of age, he went back to Massachusetts and sued to get his inheritance back. And he argued that he had been a child when all of this went down, so it's not his responsibility. And he also argued that his mother was only a woman and therefore could not be held legally responsible for her husband's actions. He got that land back. The Revolution did bring about some improvement in the status of many women. There came to be this idea of what they called Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood said, women are responsible for training future citizens. Women might not be able to directly participate in politics, but they're training the boys who will become the men who are involved in politics. And so women ought to be educated. They ought to understand current events so that they can teach their sons to be good citizens and teach their daughters to raise good citizens. Some patriot leaders believe that women ought to maybe just some women, but still, have access to a college education so that they can best instruct their sons, they said, in the principles of liberty. Now, the idea of Republican motherhood, that women should be educated and women should be aware, that reinforced the idea of a companionate marriage. Revolutionary marriages, these companionate marriages, were not supposed to be held together by stern male authority, but based on affection and companionship and mutual help, working together. In her letter to John in March of '76, Abigail Adams told her husband that men should give up the harsh title of master for the more endearing one of friend. Now, the structure of family life itself changed after the Revolution. In colonial America, households had often included not just the nuclear family, but extended families, indentured servants, apprentices, sometimes slaves. But afterward, especially in the North, a more, modern idea of family took hold. Households became mostly nuclear families, parents and their children, maybe an elderly grandparent. But servants were no longer considered part of the family, and fewer families every year had indentures or unpaid apprenticeships. And like slaves, some women took the language of the Revolution and used it for themselves. Abigail Adams did. Anne Baker Carson used the language of the Revolution and the idea of natural rights in an abandonment case. During the Revolution, she had run off and left her husband. He was extremely abusive to her. And when the court had her arrested for abandoning her husband, she defended herself by saying, "I am an American. A land of liberty has given me birth. I am his equal." And she said she left rather than continue as a female slave. So the revolution is not just about the political change in who governs. It's all of these changes in society. It's this moment of starting to look toward a kind of society that we would recognize, rather than having, the pre-revolution colonies in many ways are still kind of medieval. But because of the influence of the Enlightenment and classical liberalism and classical republicanism, all of them working together here, we see this change where we sort of leave behind some of those medieval ideas, and we make this turn into a society that in many ways is starting to resemble the one that we have today. And we'll talk about how we govern all of this in the next lecture. Our first attempt at governing is going to suck really bad, actually. Won't accomplish very much. Then we'll hit on a better idea.